Ivy Foreman Lewis, a professor of biology who rose to become a top university administrator, was one of the nation's most influential eugenics educators. Starting in 1915, he taught generations of Virginians biological science from a eugenic perspective. In his course Biology C1, Evolution and Heredity, Lewis lectured his students, quote, "In the 20th century, an abundance of experimental evidence proves that the large part ascribed to environment was mostly imaginary, and that the capacity and natural bent of an individual are due to heredity." Not surprisingly, quote, "scientific racism was a central part of the university's eugenics instruction." Lewis, who admired Madison Grant and Lothrop Stoddard, was outspoken on the issue of immigration. The idea of the melting pot was simply and perilously false, he said, and the nation's openness to foreigners was endangering the, quote, "purity of the white race." In some parts of the university, the racial, quote, "science" was cruder. Robert Bennett Bean, who came to the school as an anatomy professor in 1916, researched the biology of race and propounded the idea that differences in brain size made whites and blacks, quote, "fundamentally opposite extremes in evolution." So, this is a part of another excuse in my point defined that I'm going to talk about soon, actually. So this is almost like a side video almost for me. The University of Virginia's eugenic teachings were influential because its graduates played such an important role in the state. Many served in the legislature and on the courts, and they carried their education with them. One alums Lumel Smith of Charlottesville voted for both the sterilization and racial purity laws as a state legislator. 30 years later, as a justice on the state's highest court, he voted to annul a, quote, miscegenation marriage between a white woman and a Chinese man. The university's faculty became an important force in support of eugenics in the state, the nation, and even the world. Harvey Ernest Jordan attended the first International Eugenics Congress in London in 1912 and presented a paper, quote, "The Place of Eugenics in the Medical Curriculum." Robert Bennett Bean would become the national leader in the racist eugenics, inspiring generations of white supremacist scientists with his research on subjects like, as the title of one of his papers expressed it, quote, "some racial peculiarities of the Negro brain." Oh, yikes. Another center of support for eugenics in Virginia, as in another state, was the charitable community. In Virginia, the leader in this sector was Joseph Maston, a Methodist minister who headed the state's board of charities and corrections. The legislature created the board in 1908 to be Virginia's first government-funded social welfare system. When Maston was appointed, he made clear he was interested not only in helping Virginia's disadvantaged, but also in using biological tools to reduce their numbers. One of Maston's first acts in office was to survey the scope of the problem, quote. He enlisted doctors across the state to help him determine the number of epileptics, idiots, and feeble-minded and crippled children. Maston issued reports that emphasized the size of this population, and he used his platform to argue that these disabilities had hereditary origins. Quote, "The child of normal parents may be feeble-minded, but it is impossible for the children of feeble-minded to be mentally normal," he wrote. Maston propounded the common eugenic refrain about the differential fecundity of the feeble-minded. They produced at a dangerous rate, he advised in one report, quote, "about twice as rapidly as normal stock," End quote. Maston called on Virginia to protect itself from what he saw as a looming threat. He advocated a law barring the feeble-minded from marrying, as well as a broader, unspecified legislation, quote, for the prevention of the procreation of the feeble-minded. Doctors were another sector of Virginia society that, as in other parts of the county was particularly drawn to eugenics. In the early 1900s, physicians from across the state took to the pages of their Virginia Medical Semi-Monthly to argue that defectives should be barred from marrying. Dr. A. Einer from Rural Retreat, a small town in the southwest part of the state, made the case in 1905 article, quote, Medical Supervision of Matrimony. He called on the state to create panels of doctors to conduct eugenic examinations of couples before they granted marriage license. It was the only way, Dr. Einer insisted, to prevent unions that would produce, quote, diseased and degenerate progeny who would lead to national degeneration. Other Virginian doctors went further, arguing in favor of eugenic sterilization. Dr. H.W. Dew of Lynchburg was alarmed by growing ranks of feeble-minded women who were notoriously immoral, he thought. They were prone to give birth out of wedlock, he warned, citing one feeble-minded woman he said he knew who would, quote, two illegitimate children by their own father. Dr. Dew called for a program of sterilization of the confirmed criminal and mentally defective. Dr. L.S. Foster of Richmond addressed a meeting of the Medical Society of Virginia about the threat posed by defective members of the population. Using case studies from state hospitals, he urged that the feeble-minded, syphilis, and immorality had a hereditary basis. His answer was emphatic. We must have a sterilization law, he said, though there was yet no law in Virginia authorizing eugenic sterilizations. Doctors in the state had already begun performing them. The subjects were blacks and poor whites, people on the margins of society with little ability to resist. In 1908, Dr. Charles Carrington, a surgeon at the Virginia State Penitentiary in Richmond, told the National Prison Association Conference that he was unreservedly of the opinion that sterilization of our habitual criminals is a proper measure, and he mentioned having sterilized 2 black men. Using the crude racial imagery of the time, Dr. Carrington described one of his unfortunate subject as, quote, a debased little Negro, a notoriously lusty, boastful sodomist and masturbator, end quote. Another physician, Dr. Bernard Barrow, reporter in the Virginia Medical Semi-Monthly in 1910, that he had sterilized 5 mentally deficient black men. Dr. Barrow was blunt about the role his racist views played in the decision to sterilize. Quote, the Negro was, quote, the savage race that could not solve its own, quote, social and sanitary problems, he said. The responsibility lay with, quote, the strongest race, quote, the white man. Dr. Barrow got around the absence of the law authorizing sterilization by asserting, improbable though it was, that the men had agreed to the procedure. He underscored the claim in the title of his article, quote, vasectomy for the defective Negro with his consent. So when they talk about like sanitary issues, I bet you this is like them being denied vaccinations, and so them dying and looking all like sick, they get to like judge them and scapegoat off of that. You know, I'm pretty sure this is what the Nazis did to the Jews. They did experiments on them and made them like roll around in their own filth or something like that, and then they were like scapegoating by calling them animals and that this is how they truly are. Yeah, pretty messed up.